43. He couldn't give you 43 seconds to ask how you were doing?
Before we continue, please take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'd really love to see how far this story has reached and connect with people from all around the world. I have lived in this house for 31 years, and in all that time, I have never once been afraid of the silence it holds. My husband Gerald liked to say that a quiet house is a house that has learned to breathe on its own. After he passed, I came to understand exactly what he meant. The stillness here is not empty. It is woven through with the sounds of everything we built. Together, the particular creak of the third stair, the way wind moves against the kitchen window in March, the faint ticking of the grandfather clock. He founded an estate sale in 1994 and spent 3 weekends restoring by hand. I am 72 years old. My name is Miriam Calloway, and I am telling you this story because no one else will, and because I have finally reached the age where telling the truth feels more urgent than keeping the peace. It was a Wednesday in October when everything changed. I remember the season precisely because I had spent the morning raking the maple leaves in the backyard, the big one Gerald planted when our son Thomas was born, and my back had been aching from the effort. I came inside, washed my hands, and noticed the red light blinking on my old answering machine. I still have one of those. My daughter-in-law Renata thinks it's charming, in a quaint, slightly pitiful way. She once said so at the dinner table, and Thomas laughed, and I said nothing. I pressed play. It was Thomas. His voice had a quality I had not heard in some. Time rushed, slightly performative in its casualness. The tone people use when they are delivering news they know will sting and want to get through quickly. Hi, Mom, it's me. Hey, listen. About Thanksgiving, we've been talking it over, and Renata's family really needs us this year. Her mother hasn't been well, and there's a lot going on. I know, it's disappointing. We'll try to do something before Christmas, okay? Love you. That was the entire message. 43 seconds. I counted when I played it back, which I did 4 times. Not because I misunderstood, but because I kept waiting for the part where he asked how I was. It did not come. I sat down in the kitchen chair, the one with the slightly uneven leg that I have always meant to fix, and looked out the window at the maple tree. Its branches mostly bare now. The leaves I had raked lay in a pile at the edge of the yard. I thought about how long I had tended that tree, how I had worried over it during the dry summer of 2012, how I had called an arborist when something was wrong with the bark, how it had never once occurred to me that the boy born beneath its shadow would one day call me on a Wednesday afternoon to tell me, in 43 seconds, that I was not needed. I did not cry. Something had shifted in me that felt older and quieter than grief. I went back outside and finished raking the leaves. What I want to explain before I go further is that I had spent years telling myself a story about my family. It was a reasonable story, as such stories go. Thomas was busy. Thomas had a demanding career. Thomas had married into a family with different rhythms and expectations, and navigating that was complicated. Renata was not a warm woman, but she was not cruel either. Or so I believed. She kept her distance from me the way some people keep their distance from anything that reminds them of a time before them. I understood that. I told myself I understood that. What I had not permitted myself to understand was the pattern. The previous Christmas had been at her parents' house in Scottsdale. The one before that, Thomas and Renata had gone to Europe, a trip they had apparently been planning for a year, without mentioning it to me until November. The Thanksgiving before this one, they had come for exactly 3 hours, before claiming an early flight the following morning. I had made a turkey, a sweet potato casserole, 2 pies. We ate quickly. Renata commented that the kitchen smelled like her grandmother's house, and then clarified. That was not necessarily a compliment. I stood at the answering machine for a long time after the 4th playthrough. Then I did something I had not done in perhaps 2 years. I pulled out the small leather journal I kept in the nightstand drawer. and I began to write. Not a letter to Thomas. Not yet. Just the facts, as clearly and honestly as I could state them. When I last seen my son, how often we spoke, what the conversations contained, how much I had given, and how little I had asked in return. The numbers, once I began adding them, were startling in their plainness. I had paid for Thomas's graduate school application fees when he was 27 and between jobs. I had lent him $4,000 to cover moving costs. When he and Renata relocated to a larger apartment, money I had never been repaid and never asked about. I had purchased Renata's mother's surgery gift basket, the hotel stay when they visited for a weekend 2 summers ago, 3 months of their car insurance when Thomas's firm delayed a paycheck. None of this had been discussed. None of it had been offered with conditions. It was simply what you did. It was simply what I believed a mother did. I wrote it all down. Then I closed the journal, made myself a cup of chamomile tea, and sat in Gerald's chair by the window and watched the last of the October light go out of the sky. I was not angry yet, but I was becoming honest. And that, I would learn, was both more dangerous and more necessary than anger. Gerald had a saying, "Numbers don't have feelings, but they tell the truth better than people do." He was an accountant for 32 years, quiet and precise, the kind of man who found comfort in columns that balanced. I used to tease him that he thought in spreadsheets. He would smile and say that at least spreadsheets never lied to him. After that October evening, I began to think like Gerald. Over the following week, I pulled out old bank statements. I dug through the accordion file in the closet, where I kept my financial records, organized by year in the way Gerald had taught me. Never sure when something might matter, I had kept everything. Credit card statements, receipts I had photographed on my phone and printed out at the library, check stubs. The picture they painted was not dramatic in any individual line item. It was the accumulation that took the breath out of me. In the 6 years since Gerald passed, I had given Thomas, or spent on Thomas and Renata's behalf, just over $40,000. I wrote that number in the journal 3 times, as if repetition might make it more comprehensible. It did not. $40,000. Nearly all of the modest inheritance I had received from my own mother, who had lived carefully and left what she could. Money I had told myself was being held for emergencies. Money I had believed I was sharing with my son in the spirit of family. What I had not permitted myself to see was that the requests had only ever flowed in one direction. I had asked Thomas for help twice in 6 years. Once when the furnace failed in January and I needed someone to drive me to the hardware store because my car was in for repairs. He was busy. He sent a gift card to a home goods store instead. The second time was after a minor fall in the backyard. Nothing broken, but I had been shaken and wanted company. Renata had a work function. Thomas called from the car to make sure I was all right and said he would try to come by that weekend. He did not come. I am not telling you this to make Thomas into a villain. I have spent too much of my life softening stories to make them more palatable, more forgiving, more likely to preserve the peace. What I am telling you is the truth, which is that my son had grown accustomed to receiving and had never in any meaningful way learned to give. I think about how that happened. I was not a passive mother. I was, I believe, a loving one. Perhaps too loving in the particular way that mistakes sacrifice for devotion. When Thomas was small, I told him that family meant you showed up. I showed up for every school event, every illness, every disappointment and triumph. I thought I was teaching him what love looked like in practice. What I may have inadvertently taught him instead was that some people simply show up, and others simply wait to be shown up for. Gerald would have caught it sooner. He had a way of seeing Thomas clearly that I could never quite manage. When Thomas was in his 20s, Gerald once said to me quietly, after a phone call, in which Thomas had complained at length about a boss, without once asking how we were, "Miriam, The boy thinks the world has a center, and he is it. I told Gerald he was being uncharitable. I believed what I said. I owe Gerald an apology. In the second week of my accounting, I also began paying attention to the small things I had dismissed over the years. The way Renata never looked directly at me when we spoke, preferring to address the air slightly above my head. The way Thomas, at family gatherings, had taken to agreeing with everything she said in a quick, performed way that suggested not agreement, but exhaustion. The way my calls had shortened from 20 minutes to 10 to sometimes less than 5. I had told myself these things meant nothing, that relationships shift, that grown children are busy, that I should not require too much. A neighbor of mine, a woman named Dolores who had become my closest friend in the years since Gerald died, sat at my kitchen table one afternoon and listened to me lay out everything I had discovered. She did not say much while I spoke. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I have thought about nearly every day since. "Miriam," she said, "when did you decide that loving your son meant disappearing yourself?" I did not have an answer. I am not sure I have one yet. But the question broke something open in me. Not painfully, exactly, but the way light breaks through a window that has been painted shut for so long that you forgot there was a window at all. That evening, I called my attorney. Not to do anything. Not yet, just to ask some questions. About what shared account access meant legally. About what recourse existed, hypothetically, for someone who discovered that funds had been accessed in ways she had not explicitly authorized. My attorney, a practical woman named Frances who I had used for estate planning years ago, listened carefully. She asked me to compile documentation. I already had it. I did not sleep well that night, but I slept honestly. And when I woke in the morning and made my coffee and sat by the window with the maple tree still holding its last few brown leaves, I felt something I had not felt in longer than I could name. I felt like myself. It was a fragile feeling, and I did not trust it entirely. But it was there, and it was mine. I have never been a woman who enjoyed confrontation. For most of my life, I mistook that for a virtue. Patience, they call it, or grace. I understand now that it was sometimes neither. Sometimes it was simply fear wearing a more presentable name. The confrontation found me anyway. It was a Saturday, the first weekend of November. Gray and cold in the way that upstate New York does November. A determined, no-argument cold that tells you summer was never really serious. I had spent the morning baking. Not for any particular reason, just because baking had always been the thing I did when my mind needed somewhere to go that wasn't inside itself. I made a loaf of bread and a batch of oatmeal cookies, and I was standing at the counter with flour still on my hands when the knock came at the door. It was not a soft knock. Thomas stood on the front porch with Renata behind him, and his expression was one I recognized from his adolescence. The particular tightness around his jaw that meant he had rehearsed what he was going to say, and was determined to say it regardless of what happened. "We need to talk," he said. I stepped back to let them in, but I did not take their coats. I noticed that myself, afterward, the small defiance of not reaching for their coats. We sat in the living room. Renata sat with her hands folded in her lap and said nothing for the first several minutes, which I found more unsettling than if she had spoken. Thomas had discovered that I had closed a joint savings account we had maintained since he was in his 20s. It was a holdover from a time when I had wanted him to have access to emergency funds, an arrangement I had continued out of habit long after the logic for it had expired. I had closed it quietly 3 weeks earlier, after my conversation with Frances. I had said nothing to Thomas about it. "Why would you do that without talking to me?" he asked. I found, sitting across from my son in the living room where he had learned to walk, that I had an unusual amount of clarity. I had rehearsed nothing. I simply knew what was true. "Because it was my money," I said. And because when I looked at the transaction history, I found withdrawals I didn't make. The silence that followed was different from other silences I had known in this room. It had a texture. Renata's hands tightened in her lap. Thomas's jaw worked for a moment before he spoke. "Those were loans," he said. "We talked about those." "We talked about some of them," I said. "Not all, Mom." His voice shifted into something softer and more dangerous, the tone that had always worked on me before, the tone that reminded me of his childhood, of how much I loved him, of how that love had sometimes made me incapable of seeing clearly. "You know how tight things have been. You know we're doing everything we can." "I do know that," I said. "I also know that I have given more than $40,000 in the last 6 years. I know that I have asked for help twice and been declined both times. I know that last month you called to tell me in 43 seconds that I wasn't needed for Thanksgiving, and you did not once ask how I was." He was quiet. "I counted the seconds," I said. Renata spoke then. "This is about the voicemail." Her voice carried a particular kind of contempt that she usually kept more carefully, concealed the contempt of someone who believes they are tolerating something beneath them. "You've been brooding about a voicemail." "I have been thinking," I said. "There is a difference." Thomas leaned forward. "What do you want from us? What are you actually asking for?" It was a reasonable question, and it deserved a reasonable answer. "I want to be treated like a person," I said, "not a resource. I want you to call me sometimes when you don't need anything. I want to be asked how I am. I want to matter to you outside of what I can provide." I paused, and I want to know what you took from that account without asking me. He could not tell me. He looked at Renata. She looked at the middle distance. The conversation that followed was terrible in the way that necessary conversations often are, jagged and exhausting, and full of accusations dressed as explanations. Thomas said I was being dramatic. Renata said I had always made things difficult. I said nothing for a while and let them speak, and I noticed that they never once, not once, acknowledged that they had done anything wrong. The closest Thomas came was saying that communication could have been better on both sides, which is the language people use when they want to distribute blame without accepting any. When they finally left, I locked the door and stood in the hallway and listened to the sound of their car pulling away. Then I went to the kitchen and ate 3 of the oatmeal cookies I had made that morning. They were very good. Gerald's recipe. Technically, he had been the better baker of the two of us, a fact I had found charming about him for decades. I thought about what Dolores had said. When did you decide that loving your son meant disappearing yourself? I thought I was beginning to understand the answer. The following Monday, Frances called to tell me she had reviewed everything I had sent her. Her tone was careful, professional, not without warmth. She said that some of what she had found gave her concern, not about me, about certain patterns in the account activity that suggested money had been redirected in ways that might require further review. She advised me to be cautious about any communication with Thomas for the time being. She advised me to document anything he sent me. I said I would. After I hung up, I sat for a long time in Gerald's chair. I thought about the boy Thomas had been, the way he had cried the first day of kindergarten, so hard that the teacher had looked at me with alarm. The way he had stood at Gerald's hospital bedside and held his father's hand without needing to be asked. The way he had, once upon a time, been someone who called me just to talk, who sent cards at Easter, who told me I was funny when I made a joke. I grieved that boy quietly in the late November afternoon, and then I stood up, because there was still dinner to make, and my own life to tend. Frances called me on a Tuesday morning in early December to tell me that the matter had grown more complex than either of us had expected. I was in the middle of my second cup of coffee, watching snow come down in the slow, deliberate way it does when it intends to stay. I had been sleeping better in the weeks since the confrontation with Thomas, which surprised me. I had expected the waiting to be its own kind of torment. Instead, I found that having finally decided to act, had given me something I had not possessed in longer than I could say. A sense of my own weight. The feeling of taking up space in the world in a way that was not apologetic. Frances told me what she had found with the careful clarity of someone who has learned to deliver difficult news without editorializing. There were financial irregularities in Thomas's affairs that went beyond the account withdrawals I had flagged. Thomas had filed for a form of debt protection earlier in the year, a process that required full disclosure of assets and financial support. In that filing, he had declared no significant outside assistance, no family contributions, no shared access to accounts belonging to others. The implications of this did not require explanation. "Am I in any trouble?" I asked. "No," Frances said. "If anything, your decision to close the accounts when you did protected you considerably. Had those funds remained accessible, they could have been subject to scrutiny you'd have had difficulty navigating. As it stands, you're a creditor, not a party to any wrongdoing." I sat with that for a moment. Creditor. My son owed me money, and the law had a word for what I was. "What happens now?" I asked. She explained. There would be an inquiry. Investigators had already been in contact with her office. They would want my records. The journal, the bank statements, the text messages I had screenshotted at Dolores's suggestion over the past several weeks. They would want to understand the timeline. Frances had already advised them of my cooperation and my status. "Will he face consequences?" I asked. "That depends on what the inquiry finds," she said. But concealing assets in a legal proceeding is a serious matter. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I thought about what it meant to love someone whose choices you could not save them from. I had spent years doing for Thomas what he would not do for himself, closing gaps, absorbing costs, making things softer than they needed to be. I had told myself this was love. I think now that it was partly love and partly a kind of terror, the terror of what would happen if I stopped, of who he would reveal himself to be without the net I had strung beneath him. Now I knew who he was, and the net was gone. And I was still here. The investigators came to my door on a Thursday. There were two of them, professional and courteous, and they sat at my dining table, the same table where Gerald had done his taxes for 30 years, where Thomas had struggled through high school algebra. And they asked me questions I answered as fully and honestly as I could. I gave them copies of everything. They thanked me and told me they would be in touch. After they left, I called Dolores. She came over within 20 minutes with a container of the lentil soup she made when things were difficult. And we sat at the kitchen table and ate soup, and I told her everything, and she listened, which is what she had always been best at. When I finished, she reached across the table and put her hand over mine. "You know none of this is your fault," she said. "I know," I said. "But I also know that I made it easier than it needed to be for a long time." "That's not the same thing," she said. She was right. I am still learning the difference. In the weeks that followed, Thomas sent messages. Most I did not respond to, on Frances's advice. One arrived by letter, actual paper, in his handwriting, which I had not seen in years. He wrote that he was afraid, that things had gotten out of control, that he had made decisions he regretted and could not explain. He did not ask how I was. He did not apologize directly. He asked if I would consider providing a statement of support to the inquiry. I read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and gave it to Frances. I do not tell you this to suggest I felt nothing. I felt a great deal, grief and anger and something that was not quite pity but lived in a similar neighborhood. I thought about the maple tree and the boy who had been born beneath it. I thought about Gerald, about how he had loved Thomas with a clarity I had always envied fully, and without losing himself in the loving. I tried, in those weeks, to love my son the way Gerald would have. with clear eyes and a steady hand, and the understanding that caring about someone does not obligate you to participate in their undoing. Renata, I learned, had provided the investigators with information of her own in exchange for considerations I was not privy to. I was not surprised. There was something almost clarifying about it, the way crisis strips away. The pretense people have maintained for years and shows you exactly who they have been all along. December moved forward. Snow accumulated. I put up my small tree, the one I had used for the past 3 years, since the big artificial one had finally given out. I hung the ornaments: Gerald's glass bell, Thomas's crooked star, a ceramic snowflake my mother had given me the year I turned 30. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window and let the lights on the tree do what holiday lights have always done for me, which is make the dark outside seem less absolute. The inquiry was ongoing. My part in it was, for now, complete. I was still here. The house was still quiet in the way it had learned to breathe. And I was, for the first time in many years, exactly who I had always been before I had made myself smaller to keep someone else comfortable. Spring, when it came gradually, the way it does when winter has been particularly sincere about itself. The maple tree budded in early April, tiny and determined, and I stood at the kitchen window one morning with my coffee and watched the color return to its branches, and felt something return to me, too. Something that did not have a precise name, but that I recognized as the general direction of forward. The legal proceedings had concluded their most active phase. Thomas had faced consequences. I will not detail them here, because they are his to carry, not mine to recount. And because I have learned, finally, in my 72nd year, that there is a difference between accounting for the truth and dwelling inside it. He had made choices. The choices had found him. I had protected myself in time, and Frances had ensured that what was mine remained mine. I had not spoken to my son since the letter. Dolores asked me once, in her careful way, if I thought we would ever speak again. I told her I did not know, that I was no longer willing to hold the relationship together by myself if he was not willing to meet me, that I had spent too many years managing the distance between what he was and what I needed him to be. And I was too old now, and too honest with myself, to keep doing it. She nodded. She did not tell me I was right. She did not tell me I was wrong. She simply sat with me, which was the most generous thing anyone had done for me in years. What I did that spring was write the letter. I had been thinking about it since October, since the 43-second voicemail, since the journal and the bank statements, and the conversation with Frances and the investigators at my dining room table. I had been composing it slowly in my head without meaning to, the way you compose things that matter, not at a desk, but in the middle of the night, or while you are raking leaves, or while you are standing at a window watching a tree come back to life. I did not write it to send. I want to be clear about that. I wrote it for myself, because I had spent so much of the last several decades muffling the things I genuinely thought, and felt in the interest of keeping peace with people who had no particular interest in my peace. And I was finished with that. The letter was an act of honesty I performed for myself, the way you might speak clearly to an empty room just to hear what your own voice sounds like when it is not apologizing for itself. I wrote to Thomas about what his childhood had actually cost me, not in bitterness, but in plain language, the way Frances had taught me to speak about numbers. I wrote about what I had hoped for and what I had received instead. I wrote about Gerald, about how his death had left me in a kind of tender exposure that Thomas had not protected and had, in some ways, taken advantage of. I wrote about the $40,000 not as accusation, but as testimony. This is what happened. This is what I gave. This is what I lost. And then I wrote what I had not been able to say to his face. I wrote I love you. I have loved you since before you existed, in the way you love something you have hoped for without knowing its shape. I love the boy you were before the world made certain things convenient. I do not know what you have become, or why, or whether there is a path back from it. I am not closing that door. I am simply no longer standing in the doorway waiting for you to decide whether to come through. I wrote, I used to believe that a mother's love meant absorbing everything, every need, every failure, every silence. I understand now that this is not love. It is disappearance. I disappeared for years, so gradually I did not notice, until one morning in October, when I stood in my kitchen and listened to a 43-second voicemail and understood that I had been gone for a very long time. I wrote, I am back now. I am sorry it took me so long to come home to myself. I folded the letter and put it in the drawer with my journal. I do not plan to send it, but I read it sometimes, when I need to remember who I am and what I know. The rest of the spring and into the summer, I did things I had been postponing for longer than I could account for. I had the maple tree trimmed by an arborist, a proper one this time, not the one I had worried over it alone. I started a small garden in the side yard, tomatoes and basil and marigolds, because Gerald had always meant to and I had always meant to help him. And now, I was doing it for both of us. I started attending a writing group at the library on Tuesday afternoons, where 7 other women of various ages sat around a table and read things they had made and listened to each other, with the particular respect that comes from knowing how difficult it is to say anything true. I made dinner for Dolores twice a month. She made lentil soup for me once a month. We walked together on Wednesday mornings, not far, not fast, just far enough to feel the neighborhood in our legs and talk about everything and nothing, in the way that days, when you pay attention to them, are more various than you expect. I am not going to tell you this story ends in reconciliation. Some stories do not. Some stories end in something quieter, and I think more honest. A woman standing in a kitchen in April, watching a tree come back, knowing that she has done what she could and that the rest belongs to someone else's conscience. What I can tell you is what I have learned, which is this: love is not proof against injury. Families are not protected simply by being families from the ordinary human capacity to use one another. Money given without witness becomes money that never existed. Silence mistaken for peace is just silence. And the women who hold everything together, who absorb and endure, and keep the record quietly in notebooks beside their beds, those women deserve to know that their endurance was not nothing, that their patience was not weakness, that their keeping of records was not smallness, but a kind of meticulous courage. I deserve to know that. I am learning to believe it. Gerald's chair is still by the window. The grandfather clock still ticks. The tree is full and green now, with new leaves that know nothing about last winter and are not required to. I drink my coffee in the morning. I tend the garden. I write on Tuesday afternoons. I am here. I am fully, quietly, irrevocably here. And that, after everything, is more than enough.